There's this one message I never sent. I can see it even now. Me lying on my bed, phone in hand, thumb hovering. I kept telling myself, just send it, but I didn't. And that's where everything started to unravel. In this episode, I'm turning my almost situationship, mind you, not even almost relationship, into an episode about how pride, silence, and miscommunication have ruined everything from empires to friendships to love. The guy and I weren't together. There was no title, but there was something. A pull, a rhythm, the kind of connection that makes you reread your own text twice before hitting send. We joked, we shared real things, we talked like we knew each other in a past life until suddenly we didn't. We decided not to talk ever again. It wasn't a fight. It was just a conversation. Okay, it was two conversations because we doubled back, but it wasn't explosive. It was quiet and subtle. It was like a series of unsaid things that added to a full stop, basically. And you know how they say situationship breakups hurt worse than real relationships? Yeah. I was about 10 songs deep into the playlist I made specifically for that situation when I thought about the fact that this doesn't just happen in dating. This is how so many things fall apart. And then I thought, even when I lose, I win. New podcast episode, babes, and I am happy you're here. This is Candice Talks About Everything, a show where one tiny moment, question, or memory spirals into something bigger. Sometimes it's personal, sometimes it's historical, but it's always layered and probably a little bit weird. After a decade of working behind the scenes at the intersection of brand, culture, and partnerships, I'm always asking, what does this say about that? If that makes any sense. And the latest thought has been quiet, unsatisfying, unresolved endings. They happen everywhere, from politics to revolutions to pop culture. And this episode is about what breaks when we don't say the thing. And what might have changed if anyone had. First, I want to go back to one of the most famous love stories in history, or maybe one of the most famous tragedies of miscommunication failure ever. Cleopatra and Mark Antony. You know the story, right? Passionate, powerful, complicated, and a huge scandal back in Rome. Antony was this big Roman general, but he was all about Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt, even if it meant ditching his Roman loyalties and the strategic marriage he already had. It was a whole mess, especially when he was fighting the final battle for control of Rome against Octavian, aka Augustus Caesar, aka Julius Caesar's adopted son and heir. And shout out to the Caesars though, because that salad hits every time. Anyway, Antony had just lost at sea and was limping his loser ass back to Alexandria, waiting for the inevitable. And when he was already down bad, someone tells him Cleopatra's dead. She killed herself. Now, Cleopatra didn't actually kill herself at this point. The truth is murky, but it looks like Antony either misunderstood or someone gave him bad intel in the chaos. Either way, he believed it, and he was already so devastated, so emotionally wrecked, that this was the final blow. So he did what tragic heroes do. He fell on his own sword. And I just want to take a moment here to say, I am very dramatic. But killing myself when love is everywhere, I don't know, man. So yeah, she wasn't even dead. Turns out she was actually hiding in her monument, trying to avoid capture. But before the real story could get to him, Antony was already bleeding out. He begs to be brought to her, so they hoist him up to her monument window and he dies in her arms. Devastated by Antony's death and unwilling to be paraded as a captive in Rome, Cleopatra took her own life shortly after, famously by allowing an asp, a snake, to bite her. Or at least that's how the story goes. Even then, there's some debate. Was it really a snake or a poison she smuggled in? No one knows for sure. What we do know is this. 2 of the most powerful people of their time were destroyed by grief, loss, and a fatal case of miscommunication. 1 big misunderstanding, 2 iconic deaths, and with them, the entire Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt just collapsed. Poof. But what if we hit rewind? What if Antony, even in his despair, has sent one last scout? One quick message. Is this true? Confirm. Or what if Cleopatra's actual status had been clearly relayed instead of getting lost in the chaos? Just a simple message from her to him saying, "I'm alive, come." Or even crazier, what if someone in Antony's inner circle, seeing his state, had bothered to verify that fatal report before he acted? The sheer possibility that 2 of history's most powerful figures could be bought down by a bad game of telephone is honestly kind of wild to think about. But it happened, and the story just ends early. Sometimes we act on what we think we know instead of waiting for actual facts, and that's whack.
Your crack is whack.
This isn't just the stuff of ancient history or dramatic plays either. The whole world almost went boom over the same kind of miscommunication a few years before my mom was born. It was 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. When I think of the world my mom almost entered, I'm terrified. I mean, imagine. My grandma might not have had her, and she might not have had me, and then none of us would be here right now. Can you imagine not listening to me talk? That could have happened because for 13 days, the US and the Soviet Union were literally nose to nose, nuclear war inches away. Both sides were puffed up with pride and terrified of looking weak, so nobody was really talking. The official lines were just silent. Not silent. Again, I'm dramatic, okay? But there was only rigid formal declarations, which I think is basically the same thing, because there was no listening to understand, just listening to respond. Everyone was too scared to be vulnerable or offer a concession that might look like they were giving up. But then a few brave souls started talking on the low. Messages passed through journalists, random diplomats, and even President Kennedy's brother. It was through these risky, behind-the-scenes whispers that these 2 superpowers, who were basically paralyzed by fear of each other, figured out how to back down. They secretly agreed to pull missiles. It's fascinating how nuclear war was avoided with precisely the kind of indirect, emotionally risky, behind-the-scenes labor that often defines our most complex interpersonal dynamics. You know, when you're trying to figure out if someone likes you back or if they want you back. But what if there hadn't been those back channels? What if no one had dared to risk the unofficial conversation? What if both sides had stuck to their official pride-driven silence, waiting for the other to blink? The answer is simple. We probably wouldn't be here. There would have been no compromise, no mutual understanding of the true stakes. That silence, if it had been absolute, would have led to an actual global bomb. It just goes to show how sometimes avoiding disaster means breaking every rule about who talks to whom and how. Here's President Kennedy laying out what was at stake.
The 1930s taught us a clear lesson. Aggressive conduct, if allowed to go unchecked and unchallenged, ultimately leads to war.
And looking back at my own situation, I remember a moment early on when I assumed something instead of just asking. It felt so small and casual, just a vague signal, a comment. But instead of clarifying and asking, hey, what did you really mean by that? I let my own fears and expectations fill in the blanks. And just like that messed up message in ancient Egypt, my tiny, unaddressed assumption shifted everything. It wasn't a global bomb, but it was the kind of quiet detonation that leaves everything different, whether I want it to or not. In my experience, the hardest breaks don't usually come from one big moment. They come from the quiet buildup of unsaid things, like the situation with Issa and Molly on Insecure. And we can be real, their friendship didn't fall apart out of nowhere. The tension was always there. They loved each other, but the dynamic was lopsided. Molly saw Issa as chaotic and unserious. Hey, twin. Issa saw Molly as judgmental and controlling. They kept the jokes, traditions, and obligatory check-ins like nothing was wrong. But under all of that was avoidance of hard conversations. They couldn't admit, I don't feel supported. You hurt me. And so it built. Little moments started to feel heavier. They skipped each other's events. And when they were in the same room, you could feel the distance. By the time Molly snapped at the block party,
nobody has more drama than you, Issa. Okay, you need to figure out your and stop using people.
The breakup had already happened. It just hadn't been said out loud yet. But what if they had named it? What if, instead of avoiding the hard conversations, Issa had said, I feel judged? What if Molly had admitted, I feel like I'm carrying more than my share? What if they had stopped the performance, dropped the jokes, and said the scary thing out loud? Maybe they would have fought. Maybe it would have been messy. But maybe that mess would have cleared the air instead of letting everything slowly rot beneath the surface. Maybe the friendship would have bent, but not broken. Maybe they would have found their way back sooner. I remember trying to figure out how to say what I meant in my situation without sounding desperate. I'd type out, hey, can we talk? And then delete it. Or I'd start, I miss you. Delete. I convinced myself silence was stronger, that it would protect me from feeling small and from getting hurt. But if I'm honest, it wasn't just fear. It was pride. I didn't want to look desperate or exposed. I thought staying quiet kept my dignity, but all it really did was protect the space between me and old boy from ever being bridged. And I hate that I let both fear and pride win. Researchers Morrison and Milliken studied this. They wrote that silence is often a strategy to avoid conflict, but it reinforces the very conditions people fear. We think we're keeping the peace, but really we're setting the stage for exactly what we're trying to avoid. And no one's immune to this kind of slow drift. Not countries, not couples, not even the giants we look up to, the ones who shape entire cultural movements. I'm talking about Zora Neale Hurston and Langston Hughes, two powerhouses of the Harlem Renaissance. They were friends, collaborators, and cultural architects. They wrote letters to each other and built something that felt like a creative partnership rooted in mutual respect. And then it all fell apart. They co-wrote a play called Mule Bone, a comedy based on Black Southern folklore. It was supposed to be a celebration of Black life written by Black writers for Black audiences, but somewhere in the process, things got messy. There were disagreements over credit, ownership, and publishing rights. Some say Zora tried to copyright the play without Langston's permission. Others say Langston went behind her back. The facts aren't clear, but the result was. They stopped speaking, kind of like me and that dude. No public fight, no closure, just a whole lot of people around them taking sides. The worst part is Mulebone never got produced in their lifetimes. A play that could have made history ended up being buried for decades because of something that could have been avoided or fixed. What if Zora had gone to Langston first? What if she said, "I'm worried about protecting this. I want to make sure this play stays ours"? What if they had sat down together face to face and worked out how to share credit and control before lawyers and paperwork turned it into a fight? Maybe Mulebone would have opened on a Harlem stage. Maybe it would have been the first of many plays they built together. Stories that shaped how Black life was seen and celebrated. Maybe their friendship wouldn't have been buried with the script. But they didn't. And the repercussions of that unaddressed shift echoed through their lives and beyond. It shaped the memory of their work. Alan Locke, one of the leading voices of the Harlem Renaissance who tried to mediate as the Mulebone fight simmered, wrote in private letters about his disappointment. He called it unfortunate and wished they had found a way to harmonize their talents. But publicly, nothing. No essay, no open letter urging them to fix it. Arna Bontemps, a poet, novelist, and historian who was part of their circle, called the rift a loss of Black literature. But even he didn't tell the full story. Just hints, a quiet mourning for what could have been. And Carl Van Vechen, a powerful patron of the Harlem Renaissance, wrote to a friend with a kind of resigned shrug. It was bound to happen, I suppose. Too much brilliance in one room. What you're left with is this: two friends, two legends, and a silence so deep their peers stayed out of it. No one stepped in to help them write a different ending, and maybe no one could have. Everyone pieced it together after the fact. From fragments, from court records, from scraps of letters and whispered recollections. That unaddressed conflict became a void into which speculation and unanswered questions inevitably flowed. Now, take that idea of speculation and scale it to an entire institution, like BET and the Black community. When BET was sold to Viacom in 2001, it was publicly announced. But for a lot of us, it didn't feel like a conversation. There was no community-wide reckoning, no real clarity about what would change, and no effort to say, here's what this means for the future of Black storytelling. And it felt like there should have been. BET was built on our loyalty, attention, and cultural capital. We tuned in and made it what it was. So when it changed without real explanation, it felt like being cut out of our own story. The news coverage faded, the cultural programming thinned out, and the focus shifted from community storytelling to whatever would pull the biggest numbers. Even Sheila Johnson, one of BET's co-founders, said she felt ashamed of what it became. This wasn't just a media sale. It was a silent departure from something that once saw us. And that made the change feel like deception. It felt personal because it was. It wasn't just a channel, it was a mirror. And when that mirror got foggy or only showed one narrow reflection, it left us feeling unseen and reduced to a single dimension. But what if they never sold at all? What if BET had stayed Black owned and run? And I get it. I know why Black people sell. That's the path to real wealth in this country. That's how you build something big enough to change your family's life, to secure your legacy, to finally access the kind of capital that's always been kept out of reach. And that's a conversation we can have, but that's not this conversation. Right now, I'm just wondering, what if they had found a way to grow without letting go? Wait, didn't mean to rhyme right there, but I like it. Sorry, let's get serious again. I was really being serious. Hold up, let me find the point. What if BET had stayed hours and we kept building it together? Maybe the programming would have kept evolving with us. Maybe it would have kept being a mirror with a reflection we recognized. Maybe it still would have become messy and imperfect, but rooted in care. But they did so, and what followed wasn't just a shift in ownership. It was a shift in meaning. And we saw it then, and we also saw it on what I consider to be even a bigger scale. And I'm thinking about Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. here. For years, the world talked about them like they were opposites. One, the angry radical, one, the peaceful preacher. One was seen as advocating for Black nationalism and separatism, the other for integration and nonviolence. The media, government, and even segments of their own movements amplified these perceived divisions. But if you actually look at their letters and their later interviews, you find a different truth. There was way more alignment and mutual respect than the public narrative ever allowed. They both wanted liberation and justice for Black people. Their methods differed, sure, but their goals were pretty converging. The real story was more complex and maybe more hopeful than the one that dominated the headlines. They didn't get to truly clarify that shared ground publicly before their assassinations. And as Dr. King said,
we will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the hateful words and actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people.
But what if they had gotten to public shared ground? What if they had found a way to stand side by side, not just in private respect, but in public alignment? What if they had made it clear where they agreed before the world tried to pit them against each other? Maybe they would have called for liberation in one voice, Malcolm's fire and Martin's moral authority together. Maybe their movements would have merged in ways that left no room for easy labels or divide and conquer tactics. It could have forced the country to confront racist violence and inequality sooner, or maybe in a different way. It's impossible to know, of course, but I can't help wondering. Because when voices like theirs don't get to finish their conversation, other people finish it for them. And what they say sticks, whether it's true or not, which is exactly what happened with Yoko Ono and the Beatles. Quick turn. Same kind of time in history though. For decades, she bore the brunt of the blame for breaking up the most famous band in the world. The narrative was the mysterious avant-garde artist came in and ruined everything. The woman came in and ruined everything. She was the outsider and the reason the magic died. But the Beatles were already fractured. They were dealing with internal power struggles, creative differences, financial disagreements, and honestly, big growing personal distances. These were hard, uncomfortable conversations that they largely avoided having with each other or with the public as a cohesive unit. Issa and Molly, So when the band eventually split, the unspoken tensions within the group found a convenient scapegoat in Yoko Ono. But what if they had just said it? What if John, Paul, George, and Ringo had stopped avoiding the truth and named what was breaking? What if instead of letting the resentments pile up in the studio, They sat down together, no press, no managers, and had a real messy, painful conversation. Maybe the band would have still ended. Maybe they still would have gone their separate ways, but maybe it would not have come with decades of bitterness and blame. Maybe the narrative wouldn't have needed a villain, and Yoko could have just been the woman John loved. Or maybe the actual mess of their relationship would have been the cultural punchline. And Ringo admitted it years later. He said, "We all had gone through too much. The split had to happen, but no one knew how to say it." The public, starved for a clear answer, readily embraced a ready-made villain in the absence of the band's own honest reckoning. And that situation hits close to home for me. When my own situation went quiet, it created this blank space. My friends had their theories, he probably had his. They projected their own narratives onto our silence, filled in the blanks with their assumptions about what happened, what I wanted, what he wanted. Nobody knew the real story because neither of us was willing to tell it or even figure it out for ourselves. That takes me to a really weird place because I'm thinking about villains and all that, and it makes me think about Deion Sanders and Jackson State. Coach Prime came in and sparked something real. He brought cameras, he brought talent, he brought vision. And for a moment, it felt kind of like a revolution. He wasn't just coaching, he was reframing what was possible for HBCU football. Here's Coach Prime announcing his arrival at Jackson State.
I believe that the coaching staff that we assembled that has a cumulative of 84 years of professional playing and coaching experience together combined can teach, reach, educate, inform, and can lead these kids to excellence. I'm foolish enough to believe. Do you believe?
He used his platform to uplift a community that had long been overlooked in the college sports world. He said this wasn't just about wins, it was about investment, legacy, and purpose. And people believed him because of how he showed up. Then he left. He took a coaching position at a Power 5 school, and on paper, it made sense. Similar to BET, right? More money, bigger stage, greater resources, and I get that. I get why an athlete would make that choice. When you grow up in sports, you're taught to think about winning and going as far as you can. That's part of the game. But for many people, especially in the HBCU community, it didn't just feel like a career move, especially with all that talking he was doing, you know? It felt like abandonment, not even because he left. People leave jobs all the time, but because it didn't feel clear. There was no real bridge between what he built and what he was walking towards. And it makes me think about what it could have been. What if before he left, Deion gathered the community and said, "This is why I'm going. This is how we keep building on what we started." What if he had laid out a plan to keep the spotlight on HBCU football even after he was gone? What if he had made sure the next coach or the next phase was part of the story before he stepped away? Maybe people would have still been sad, but maybe it wouldn't have felt like the mission dimmed the second he walked out the door. Leaving without naming what's next doesn't just create a gap. It invites doubt to move in. And once trust is gone, it's hard to build anything on what's left. And for me, the ultimate cost of that silence was exactly that. Doubt moved in. I didn't send the message or receive one. I didn't say what I needed or what I felt. And he didn't either. The cost wasn't just a missed connection or a short-term hurt. It was the legacy of an unresolved ending. It left a question mark where there could have been a period or even an exclamation point. It left me wondering for too long, and it shaped how I think about those quiet endings. And there's actually a name for this kind of pain. Psychologist Pauline Boss calls this ambiguous loss, the most stressful loss. It's when something ends without clarity and your brain keeps trying to solve the puzzle. And that puzzle kind of doesn't have an answer. That's why these quiet endings hit so hard. They leave you stuck between grief and hope with nowhere to land. We think silence protects us, that if we say nothing, we won't mess it up. But the truth is, silence is a choice. And like all choices, it has consequences.
I have no fear about the outcome of our struggle in Birmingham, even if our motives are at present misunderstood.
Tell me the conversation you didn't have or the thing you wish you said, because I'm listening and I need content for future episodes. If this random spiral got you thinking, leave a 5-star review and send me a message or share your own take on this topic. And definitely subscribe to the podcast, or I'll pop up from under your bed tonight and yell, "Boo." You can find me everywhere at It's Candice B. We're building a curious little corner of the internet here, and I'm glad you're a part of it. Next week, I'm talking about why poor people advocate for themselves even when nobody teaches them how. Or something like that. We'll figure it out together. Until next time, bye.